Asalaamu alaikum and good evening. Let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone with us here in the hall, but also all those that will be joining us online. I know there's a couple of friends that are listening from Brown University, Faiz Ahmad and his family. There were students of both Laura Nader and myself, so we welcome them online as they tune in to this program. This is the fourth lecture in our fall lecture series, and this lecture series attempts to put a combination of books that have been published, authors, as well as academics, both from our neighboring institutions, but others that are contributing broadly to the fields of both Islamic studies, Middle East studies, as well as anthropology, sociology, and so on. So today we really are very honored to have a friend and a colleague and a neighbor from UC Berkeley, Professor Laura Nader, who's been at UC Berkeley since 1960. So definitely she saw the ebb and flow of everything from the free speech movement to Clark Kerr being run out of town, to Reagan's administration, to the anti-Vietnam mobilization, anti-war mobilization, affirmative actions, and so on. But also Laura Nader was the first woman to actually receive a tenured position in anthropology. That just was last year, 1960. We think of history to be really very long, and affirmative action and the changes that have been brought around that brought diversity to the campus is an important piece, and need to recall that 1979, the Baki decision that really began to close the door onto the whole notion of attempting to bring about diversity on the college campus. I often mention that UC Berkeley still has about 87% of the tenured faculty are predominantly white, and 78% of them are white males. So we think that we have made major strides, but still the picture have not changed or shifted that much. Our talk today is focused on a book, What the Rest Think of the West. So I encourage those online to order this book. It's available in our bookstore, but it's also available online on Amazon. Reading and thinking about the issues that confront us, especially how the rest of the world looks at the West, because we're often are taught to think about what we think of the rest of the world, and our policies impact their daily lives in myriad ways. I'm really ecstatic to have Laura Nader with us today to discuss her book, and then we will have a question and answer period, and encourage those online as well to join us in the conversation. So it's a pleasure to really welcome Laura Nader to the microphone.
Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk once again about what the rest think of the West since 600 A.D. Since 600 A.D. It took about, the rest are the four civilizations: Japan, China, Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East. And they have been traveling west, certainly, and writing about the West since 600 A.D., when the first Chinese Buddhist went west, and west for him was India. And west for Ibn Fadlan was the Vikings. And west for the Chinese Liang was to go east to the United States. So the West, what is the West? I started this work about something like 25 or 30 years ago, because much of the work has not been translated, even still. And so I want to give you kind of a survey of the kinds of things that I covered in this book, and it comes right up to date, right up to 2015. So let me start with my early years. I was in primary school, 3rd or 4th grade, when I came home one day, and I said to my mother, "Why do Arab men treat their women badly?" 3rd and 4th grade, I was already being taught that. And my mother said, when you grow up, you will realize that this country disrespects women more than any country in the world. And how do Arabs treat women and dogs was a question my father often got asked at his business. And he said, well, they treat women and men like this, whereas in the United States it's like this. And, well, they treat dogs like dogs. But the questions and the comments in my early years was indoctrination. The other was considered mute. The other? You're going to study the other? They're going to write about us? They write? So when I was an undergraduate at a college in the East, I decided to go and study with Clyde Kluckhohn at Harvard because he had written a book called Mirror for Man. And it was about learning anthropology so that you could see yourself in the mirror. Now, Americans rarely see themselves in the mirror because we see ourselves as being superior. It's very dangerous. So I wanted to put this book out now to make people realize the other is not mute, and sometimes we can learn from what others say and what their observations are. So I, as a graduate student, looked at a reader, was assigned a reader by Carlton Kuhn, who worked for a long time in the Middle East, and he had excerpts from Ibn Fadlan, and that really turned me on. So, and then, of course, I didn't do anything with that for a while, and then Edward Said comes along, and he writes a book called Orientalism, which is really about how the West sees the East. And in that book, he says the opposite cannot happen because it's the powerful that do the looking. But he was wrong, because power moves. Things don't stay the way they are forever. And I remember so many times my students say, Professor Nader, how can you know what you know and still be optimistic? And I say, because history changes, and you should be ready for it. So I started teaching a seminar and wanted to, on the subject of Orientalism and Occidentalism, I wrote a piece called Orientalism, Occidentalism, and the Control of Women. And I said, the way men control women in patriarchal societies is they say, you want to be like them? So what Americans say, you want to be a Muslim woman? But they do the same thing. So you want to be an American woman? Do you know what the rape rate is in America? So to point the finger, they both do it, and that's the way they can control the women in their societies. And this is on TV and everything. We have to go get into Afghanistan so we can liberate their women. We have to liberate their women. Of course, we kill them in the process. So, but this paper that I wrote, Orientalism, Occidentalism, and the Control of Women, I couldn't get published in the United States. Nobody would publish it. They all had reasons. Are you saying that Muslim women have power? Are you downing your own people? Are you, whatever. They couldn't accept it. So I sent it to Belgium. It was immediately accepted. Once it was published, it then got translated into French and blah, 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 and it got translated all over the world, once you get it published. But fortunately for Belgium, right? So this Orientalism, Occidentalism, and control morphed into Occidentalisms, what the rest think of the West. And who were these people that were going west? They were Buddhist missionaries, they were diplomats, there were business traders, there were students, there were elites from all of those cultures since 600. And my students complained that I wasn't publishing what just plain Joe might be thinking, and I said, but they weren't literate. And they were surprised. That, you mean there was a time when not everybody was literate? Of course, we're not very literate, you can hear it as well. At any rate, I had to really dig for this material. I had to use librarians. I went to the Library of Congress. I met with the person that's in charge of the Chinese materials, the Arab materials, the blah blah, the Japanese, etc. They were very, very helpful. And finally, I got this collection of 4 civilizations: Middle East, China, Indian subcontinent, Japan. The question, what is West and what is a civilization, is interesting. And many people said to me, why are you just including these civilizations? Why don't you include Africans? I said, I think that's a good idea. It's just that we think we're the only civilization, and I want them to realize that these are not civilizations in the past, they're in the present. So somebody should do one on what the Africans elites think of the West, or what South Americans think of the West, and so on. It's just not in this book. Now, the Middle East, I'm going to start with a few examples. Ibn Fadlan, that was 922. He was sent from Baghdad up the Volga, really as a missionary, but he was also very well, highly educated, and he wrote about his travels, the several years of travel. And people in the Scandinavian area, there are so many translations in Russian of Ibn Fadlan's work, and mostly our people haven't even heard of Ibn Fadlan. But today, he's still being paid attention to. And he went up there and he found some weird things going on. He got there when one of the Viking leaders had died, and they had a custom that before you bury the Viking leader in the ship with a woman that has intercourse with everybody before, and then you burn them all up, the woman included, the woman, the dead man, and so on. And he thought, this is barbarian, right? And they looked at him and said, well, you just bury your person right after they're dead, and they don't even have time to, just... So each one was commenting on the other. And he wrote about both comments. And that's what a lot of these people did. They didn't just say, I'm going to study you. They said, what do you think? And they conversed. So Ibn Fadlan. And then there's a book about Crusades as viewed from Arab historian eyes. And again, each one, these are Arab historians translated by Amin Maalouf, who is a Lebanese contemporary. But he went into all of this history, and it's the same kind of thing that the historians were looking at these crusaders, converts to Christianity, right, that didn't know the difference between a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, and killed them all anyway. And this was a very interesting commentary about these barbarian crusaders. That's not what we learn in school here. The Crusades were going to liberate Jerusalem and blah, blah, blah. And then, not that many centuries after the Crusaders, once again, the West wants to invade the East. As has been said, it's amazing how patient Arab people have been with the West. Napoleon goes into Egypt. He's going to bring them civilization. It's the same speech you hear when we went into Iraq. You're going to bring them rule of law. The same speech over again. We're going to teach them. They don't even know where civilization started. So Al-Jabarti, during this period of Napoleon, 1798 to 1801, he wrote about these people that came with these messages from France, and he said, they're a bunch of hypocrites. They say they're bringing us freedom, but in fact they aren't bringing us freedom. So hypocrisy becomes an issue all the time. We are bringing you liberty and democracy, but in fact they weren't. But that left a mark on Egypt. So shortly after 1826 to 1831, Muhammad Ali sent a bunch of Egyptian men and a leader, Al-Tahtawi, to Paris to learn about these strange French people. How many people have we sent to Afghanistan to learn about them? We know, right? So what's interesting is that Al-Tahtawi, he made observations. When he got to Marseille, he said, these people sleep on stilts, beds, right? And he made comments about women showing their arms. And he was just observing, just like any anthropologist. It's a really beautiful anthropology book. But it wasn't translated into English till 2005. It was published in 1836. We are not curious about the other. And it's very interesting that Al-Tahtawi noticed all kinds of things about these people beyond the technology that he was sent to observe, and he interpreted it, wrote about it, took it back to Egypt, and tried to develop a different, not to make Egypt like France, but to accept what he thought might be good for Egypt. And then we have al-Shidyak, the founder of modern Arab literature, in something like 1887, middle 1880s. He wrote a piece that has absolutely changed the way I hear European music. He said, some people, music is very personal. And he said, I don't really like European music because it's too militaristic. And then he points out which music is militaristic, and indeed it is. Not the classical, not Mozart, but a lot of it is very militaristic. He said, but then the Europeans probably don't like our music either. They think it's too sentimental or too whatever. So they see the other and they see themselves in the mirror. And then, turn of the century, about 1904, two sisters decided to go to Europe and see what it was to shed the veil, be free, like European women were told were free. They stayed 6 years. These people didn't just stay 6 months. They stayed 6 years. They toured all over Europe, and they felt free, no veil, but then little by little they realized they were more liberated than the European women that they were visiting. And they pointed out the different ways that they were. They might be smart, but look at their conversation. They don't say things that they should be talking about in public. Their hospitality. They don't practice Christianity. If they did, they'd treat women differently. 6 years they were there. And they finally left, went home, and said, it's so good to be where it's quiet, because it was too noisy in the streets of Paris and London. So they took 6 years to appreciate where they'd come from by going abroad and looking at what they had seen. They were the few women who had traveled that I could find. There's an interesting piece I included by Ahmadinejad, a letter to the U.S. president. Ahmadinejad is those of you who know anything about Iran, is an engineer, and he was anti-Shah. He has a doctorate in transportation engineering, and he was the mayor of Tehran. But then he said, if you're Christian, President Bush, then why don't you act like a Christian? And then he quotes the rules of Christianity to him. This was published in a Paris newspaper. And I'll just end this section by saying something about a most recent one, Maysoon Sukaria, who's now teaching in London. She was invited to the United States to a conference at Columbia University. She specializes in children's education, 2 weeks after 9/11. She got to the airport. They looked at her visa. They said, "What's your religion?" She said, "I'm Sunni Muslim." And they put her in a jail. She was terrified all night long. And then they put her on a plane and sent her back to Beirut, even though she had the invitation in hand. So that was her introduction to the United States, which is a tragedy. Very smart woman who ended up doing her thesis here at Berkeley on the question of how Muslims are treated in terms of education by American educators who go there to supposedly do good. Now, I told you that the first Chinese came to west to India in 1629, and he also was these people all describe in detail what they see. They describe the markets, they know what they sell, they weigh things. The detail is phenomenal. And we're really lucky that they gave us this history. And then we have the first diplomatic mission to the United States was in 1868. And violence against Chinese workers in the United States was part of the whole business. The U.S. elections, which they thought were a joke, they're still a joke. But there was one Chinese that I want to call to your attention because we should have listened to him. He wanted to bring democracy to China. He was kicked out of China, Liang, and he went to France. He went to Japan. He read de Tocqueville. By the way, when Al-Tatawi was writing about the Parisians, de Tocqueville was writing about the United States, same time. So anyway, this guy, Liang, was kicked out. He read de Tocqueville, and he said, "I'm going to go visit this democracy." So he came to the United States. He was 28 when he published this in 1903. And he said, "I want to see two people. I want to see J.P. Morgan, and I want to see the president, Teddy Roosevelt." And then he said, "What I learned from J.P. Morgan is that American capitalism will destroy American democracy. And what I learned from Teddy Roosevelt was that American imperialism will destroy China." So he went back to China and said, "We don't need democracy. We need a very strong, centralized state." That was 1903. Talk about predictions. Corporate capitalism is destroying, it has made us a very weak democracy. And so we have, he talked about, and other people talked about, the Chinese having political feudalism, whereas the U.S. has economic feudalism. And they compare both. They don't just look at us, they compare. And they look at all kinds of things. There's some anthropologists, Chinese anthropologists that come here, and they look at the American family. They look at the bad and the good in China and here, and they're shocked at the way we treat old people in this country. I'm shocked the way we treat old people. And so you have even more recent people who come here today from China, and they record our human rights violations in the United States, because we're always pointing the finger and saying Chinese human rights violations. So they look at civil rights and Black Lives Matter. They look at surveillance. They look at the inequality and the wealth gap. and they look at the jails and how people are treated, are human rights violations. And then there was an interesting one, a man, Chinese, who came to the United States. He got his education. I think he went to Duke Law School. He knew a lot, and he was head of the loan institutions in China. And of course, we owe China a lot of money. They lend us money. A lot of people don't realize that. And the title of his piece was, "Be Nice to Countries That Lend You Money." And somewhere along the line, he was describing how he had to describe derivatives to the Chinese, and they couldn't believe that we believed in derivatives. Something that doesn't exist, we're investing in things that don't exist. Now the Indian subcontinent, is a little different. They were more interested in England for obvious reasons. And one of them, Mirza Abu Talib Khan, 1810, got on a boat and went to England. And he was dressed as he would be in that period, as he wasn't dressed like an Englishman, that's for sure. And people at the parties, they kept inviting him to parties because he was so odd, right? This Indian guy. He was a diplomat. And a woman came up and said, "Why do you treat your women badly?" He said, "That's what we ask. Why do Englishmen treat their women badly?" "What do you mean?" He said, "Well," he said, "in our country, women have their own space. In your country, they have to share the space with the man. They even have to sleep in the same bed." And then he adds, "It must be because it's cold in England." So he writes this whole piece about, which I include, about East and West and how women are viewed in both places as a way to liberate the Western woman, which is we need a lot of liberation, by the way, the Western woman. So then there are other people who write about British hypocrisy. Remember Gandhi? He wrote about the West a lot. And one time he was asked what he thought about Western civilization, and he thought, you probably all know this, he said he thought it would be a good idea. Now, what's interesting about Western civilization, from the point of view of a lot of these people, you might be surprised. They say things like, a group of Moroccan governors came to the faculty club, and I was asked to have lunch with them some years ago. And I was arguing with one of them about the fact that they had just bought these light water reactors, nuclear reactors that they had up and down the coast of Morocco. I said, "What'd you buy them for? They're a pile of junk, that's why they sold them to you. You don't even have the infrastructure to deal with this. So you're still in the debt of the French, you're not, you're colonial." Anyway, he got so, he just didn't know what more to say to me. And finally he said, "Look, the French, they have no culture, they have no civilization, but they do have technology." That's a distinction that's made by all of these people. Technology is not culture and civilization. Here we live in techno-twit country, Silicon Valley. All you have to do is talk to any of them and you realize there's something in what this guy was saying. They have technology. Technology reigns. You can't be anti-technology. Look at the kids with technology in their hands all the time and everything. And it's always on the radio. People are talking, you can buy a new what, this and that, and so on. And I'm seen as kind of weird in my department because I didn't want to use a computer. You can't deny the use of a computer. Why not? I went to my first computer conference in 1962. We knew where it was headed. I didn't want to go there. And it upsets people when they can't send you an email. They have to write you a letter. Imagine that. I'm doing a book of letters now, and the kid that's helping me never saw letters before. and he doesn't know how to read cursive. He can only print. That's what I got now for my students. So a lot of these criticisms or comments, some of them were complimentary and so forth, but some of them were right on target. And I would say that probably of the Chinese are the best observers. The Middle Easterners are the second best. The Indians love to observe the English, mainly, and criticize why they stole their resources. And the Japanese they don't really care about other people too much. So the weakest comments, I think, really come from the Japanese. And the first Japanese visit to America, 1860 and so forth, and they were really interested in the American military. They were concerned even then about the American military. And they thought that they exchanged compliments, negative compliments. They thought that when they saw Americans at dances, they thought they looked like dancing mice. And they denigrated the blacks, unlike the Chinese who did not. And they made fun of how people dressed here and so on and so forth. And I think that there were more recently, there have been more serious comments about the West. And there's a book, one of the last books that I looked at was The Japan That Can Say No. And it's really encouraging the Japanese not to act subservient to the West. And it was written in Japanese, was not intended to be translated, but got translated by the Pentagon, I think, and then got published parts of which in the Washington Post, and then all hell broke loose. And so we get a sense of how it is that the Japanese today think about us. Well, that gives you a little bit of sense of what's in the book, but let me just give you some lessons learned. One, technology is not spiritual or part of what we would call a civilization. And second, that the negatives are reciprocal. We think they're savages, they think we're devils. Third is that there are lots of human rights violations here in the United States, so tit for tat. Fourth, the place of women and children and ancestors are violence against all patriarchies. And the last lesson is self-deception. The denial that we are at war with Islam today. Every country that we have gone into is a Muslim country. How could you think otherwise? So, apropos of that last point, I wrote a piece that came out in a British journal called 3 Jihads. Islamic Jihad, Christian Jihad, and Jewish Jihad. And all hell broke loose when it was published. We all know about Islamic Jihad, right? ISIS and so forth. Jewish Jihad, they say it themselves. They send jihadi rabbis into Gaza to make killing children considered decent. And all hell broke loose. The Jewish Voice came out. They wanted to fire the editor. These are potent. People feel strongly about these issues. They wanted to fire the editor. They wanted to write a response. He said, that's fine. They didn't want me to respond. And he said, no, she has to be able to respond. It's the shortest publication I ever had, one sentence. Jihadism is alive and well in all monotheistic religions in the Middle East. So there's much to learn about how the others see us. And I think I would just like to leave it at that and open it to questions and comments.
So we have this microphone, so if you want to come, line up and ask your question. Emphasis on question, not on a 2-hour lecture, please.
I want to ask you your opinion. As a Muslim woman, I've been in Switzerland, and one day I was going out, and
You're too close to the phone. You're too close to this. I can't really. I'm getting blurred.
Okay. As I say, one day I was in Switzerland, and one day I was going out, and I saw 5 women in black. So I went running. I thought they're Muslim women, and I find they are nuns. And the thing which confused me is I don't see the Europeans see the nun as oppressed, while they see women with hijab unoppressed. I see also women in, nuns who go into the silent order. They don't see it as oppression for women. While they see anything a Muslim woman does, it is a sign of oppression. So that's when I want your comment on that. Why the West is seeing things in others, but they don't see things on themselves or in their culture.
Because it's to the advantage of the patriarchy.
Yes.
And we're a patriarchal society, although most people don't want to admit that. And so you want to do whatever makes... Look, who wants to put a headline that says every day in the United States 2 to 3 women are murdered by their partners? Does that happen in Muslim countries? I don't know. But we point the finger. Pakistan, honor killings, right?
Yes.
So we know about them, but we don't know about us. It's just to the advantage of us.
Yeah. And another comment I want to say, my son went to Iraq. He was a soldier in the beginning of the war. And this thing never came in the media about the evangelical movement in here in this country, how they want to evangelize the Muslims. So he was telling me that they went there and suddenly the United States Army landed and behind them another army of evangelical. And they want to, Christianize the people there. And he told me that a lot of generals stopped them. They say, "Are you crazy? You want to kill us all?" Because the people in Iraq, Christian, Muslim, and Jews, they live all together. They never evangelize each other. So, you can't do that. And those things, as you said, doesn't show in the media or nobody knows anything about it.
Who tells you that coexist, which you see on Berkeley cars sometimes, was invented in the Middle East? That's how they coexist. That's why they existed under the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. Coexist means mutual respect, right?
Right. Yeah.
That's what they had when the Crusaders got there. There was mutual respect. In fact, since they couldn't tell the difference, they took all the Jews in Jerusalem, put them in the synagogue, and set the synagogue on fire. I mean, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. I just wondered how technology, the example of satellite television or cell phones or internet changes.
It did something in Egypt during the uprising, but other people disagree with that assessment.
Right.
They say it would have happened anyway because you've had rebellions in the Middle East before. So I don't think it's settled.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for asking.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. You mentioned that West still has a lot of patriarchy, and that's why they still see Muslim women as oppressed. But here the question is that it's usually the feminist voices which actually talk about the oppression of Muslim women who do not want to see the agency of Muslim women. So how do you reconcile these contradictions?
Well, we should really get smart about... I want to write a piece that's going to be called The Feminists in My Life, mainly men. So there are feminists in Islam that are mainly men and mainly women, and there are both men and women on the other side. So some women don't want to be liberated, and they'll give you all the reasons why. And a lot of women that have come from the Middle East give their fathers credit for lifting them up and wanting them to become more modern. Did that answer your question?
But still, the question remains that feminism as a political ideology in the West, which talks about the liberation of women in the West, why is it not able to accord the same status to women outside of the West? Why this kind of hypocrisy existing?
I think we need to talk about that after.
Sure.
Okay.
Hello. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. An implicit message is that there's a need to learn about the other, which I would agree with. So my question for you is, can that happen from the bottom up? And if so, what would that look like on a mass scale?
Can learning about the other happen from the bottom up? Yeah, I think so. I remember when my first child was asking my mother about blacks. She just met blacks. She wanted, why are they, what's different? And my mother took her into nature. And she said, you see that tree? That's different from this tree, and this is different from that. And we're all human beings, basically, is a common thing the Arabs always say. But I think that we teach technology in this country before we teach about the world. We should be teaching world history. Right now, if never before, we need world history. This is the beginning of thinking about world history. Because if we're only going to survive if we think that we are all humans, all of us, not some and not others. And life is precious for all people, right? So we're coming into an era with all of this climate change stuff where we realize we can't live the way we've been living. There's not enough stuff to live that way, and it doesn't make people happier, and there's no place to put the junk anymore, and the climate is changing, and it has something to do with industrialization. Western industrialization, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Salams to Zaytuna, and thank you for being here. My question is about when you talked about jihad. I liked where you were going with the article. Sorry, I have to be able to, I guess, them to hear about jihad. I find that I understand where you were going with the article that you were writing about the 3 types of jihad, or like the Christian, Jewish. But I found, even as a Muslim myself, growing up in the suburbs, or that sometimes the Western media likes to take these words and use it against us. But the real jihad is about inner struggle, not so much about, like, I like this one article that said about hijacking of Islam, but I took it further, meaning like, I'm not going to let anybody hijack my faith or culture, just like, because someone looks more conservative or does something bad does not mean they represent all Muslims, just like they don't represent all Christians or all Jews. So I think it's always good, maybe I'd like to read that article, but I always like to point out that to take back those words from those that want to demonize other cultures, So if any thoughts on that issue? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for your talk. You talked about the West and how people in the West view, the rest of them, and the other way too. And in a different context, you have, in the past, addressed the issue of anthropologists and people in academia not studying the powerful, and looking and not studying, as you said, you famously said once about the colonizer, but not studying but only studying the colonized, or not studying the affluent, but studying, the people in poverty. And I wonder if you have seen the difference now, since you talked about that, in the academia in this country, for instance, or in Western academia anywhere, if you know of, where that has changed, that has shifted, that are we actually trying to study the powerful and the rich, and those who are actually, and the patriarchy, for that matter.
Yeah,
have you seen a change in that? Are you seeing a trend in that?
Yeah, I wrote a piece called Up the Anthropologist, published in 1969, in which I argued that we should study the colonizer as well as the colonized. And when I delivered that in New York, somebody jumped up to me and said, we know how to do that. And I said, you mean we know how to go study the booga booga and survive being eaten by the cannibals, but we don't know how to study power? That was 69. Now everybody does it in anthropology. They're studying science, big science. They're studying, Ashraf Ghani is an anthropologist. He's president of Afghanistan. And I'm teaching a class in which I'm saying to them they should try to think about how they would advise Ashraf Ghani as anthropology students as to what he should do now, right? So can he be an anthropologist and be the president of Afghanistan? So there's a lot of power studies now. And at the meetings in Washington, D.C. at the end of November, there's going to be enormous amount of work exactly on this subject because they want to speak truth to power, in quotes.
And just to follow up on that, do you see that change happening here in the West or in other countries as well?
It's happening in the West, happening certainly in Brazil and other countries that have anthropology, somewhat in India. And so they're both. I never said you should only study the powerful. I said you should study up, down, and sideways. Everybody. So you don't understand the poor unless you understand the rich. And when we were hiring, in quotes, diversity at Berkeley a couple of years ago, the black candidates, one of them was studying poverty, black poverty in Chicago. And I said, well, tell me what you want to do with your future. In 10 years, could you see yourself studying rich people? He said, never. I said, what if you found out that the rich people made the poor people poor? He said, I'm not interested in rich people. So it's still divided, but there are very good works that are being done.
Thank you. I wondered, in what you have studied and wrote about non-Western accounts of the West, have you encountered observations about male circumcision? Because there's so much noise here in the West about female circumcision, and that seems to be one of the big blind spots.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question about female circumcision, and of course there's male circumcision as well. And it's been made a big deal of as a way to put people down. And there's a doctor up in, I think it was Oregon or Washington, who wrote a book about both of these things happening worldwide. He did a comparison worldwide. I mean, there are a lot of boys that die from male circumcision, and female circumcision varies enormously from one part of the country to another. And of course, we have breast implants in our country. Some people think that's related to, to surgery, the body, changing the body, and so on. So I think that the Italians are on top of that. If you want some references, I can give them to you. And other countries are beginning to realize that this is a way, again, to poke the finger, point the finger. You circumcise,
Yeah, but did you see that on the other side too? Were there observations about male circumcision in the West by non-Westerns?
No, I haven't seen it.
No, okay.
I haven't, except for this American doctor that I was just mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you for your speech. semi-related to what you're talking about with jihad and using the term jihad, Christian, Jewish, Muslim. Today, the word terrorist is kind of loaded, so that, when a white guy commits a crime, he's called a lone wolf or he has mental problems. That term terrorist is only reserved for Muslims. So have you written about that, or what do you think about how we use the word terrorist, and has that kind of come to be associated with the term jihad, where it's only associated with Muslims?
You mean linking terrorism with jihad?
Or with Muslims. You'll only see that word used when we're talking about a Muslim.
The best book on that has been written by a Basque anthropologist named Zaytuna. And the Basques have plenty of terrorism, right? And he's written a book about how terrorism, state terrorism, leads to more terrorism, right? And it's just another way of pointing the finger. It's just the Muslims that are terrorists and other people are not terrorists. Right. That's why this phrase, state terrorism, came up. And so you could say that Americans going to Iraq, that's terrorism, state terrorism.
Right.
Killed 1 million people, right?
And then kind of related to that, so there are certain others that tend to be viewed in a more benign manner. So for instance, Buddhists, or less so Hindus, would not be associated with violence or terrorism, and yet we have the Rohingya Muslims who are now being,
Hindus.
Well, no, the Rohingya Muslims are being kicked out, and they're being this action of the military is being encouraged by Buddhist monks, and yet you have this sticking belief that Buddhism is peace and love, and despite the actions that are now hitting the media, that association stays very strong. So it's not only the West that tends to view itself a certain way. The West views others in a certain hierarchy where Muslims are violent, Buddhists are peaceful,
Have you ever heard of the Akbar Ahmad?
What's the name?
Akbar Ahmad?
Yes.
Well, he's done films on this, the Islam in the West and Islam in the East, and back and forth, and he's all over the place in Washington. He's at American University. He's written a wonderful book called The Thistle and the Drone, which is really a critique of Barack Obama's droning in Waziristan and other places. Oh, he's heroic. He's an anthropologist, and I think he does the best work in that area.
All right, thank you. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask your input or your opinion. I remember a Muslim woman, she said, nobody asked me about if she's oppressed or oppressed or not. Everybody assume, and especially in the West. Now, when I go to the Middle East, and especially Saudi Arabia, I found a lot of the elite there, or educated women, they're complaining really severely about Western feminists. We will see Western feminists, unfortunately, instead of learning about the feminist movement in the Middle East or what exactly going in the Middle East, they follow the same narrative of the media, of the conservative, especially conservative media, and label Islam and Muslim and women at the press. We have no idea, and we will see they have no connection with the women in the Middle East. They never even asked them about them, and I see that. I see that as myself. When I live here, when I go to Saudi Arabia, I was impressed to see the women movement there. And I say, I don't hear that in America.
You have to have more people on TV and more people. You got to get into the business. That's what Akbar Ahmad said. He's got to get, American Muslims haven't been doing what they should do.
Yeah, but the problem is here, to me, is when the left, the women feminists, they're supposed to be educated. They're supposed to be learning about the world. They're supposed to sympathize and help the women in different places, when they have no idea and they come as a superior,
of course,
as very nasty. I met some of them, and I was really upset with the American, feminist movement.
It's imperialism. It's a form of imperialism.
Yeah, but it is sad because the people in the Middle East, they hear about the woman movement here in America. They're asking for right, but they're no different. And why is that? And how to change that? How to change the attitude of the feminist movement here.
Well, look, some people are doing it with film, some people are doing it with novels, some people, Akbar Ahmed does it with poetry, he does everything you can imagine. And if you look at what he's doing and you multiply that by the people in this room, something starts to happen, right?
Yeah.
And it happens slowly, but it happens.
But why women department in most of the elite university here? They're supposed to know, they're supposed to know about the world. They're supposed to know more about what's going on in the rest of the world. But when you see them repeating the same like Fox, that's appalling. That to me is shocking.
Yeah.
And I see that. I have been in a lot of group, I've been with a lot of group, I've been to women department, and I see this is still the mentality, superiority, ignorant about the rest of the world, about women, and they become very superior, as you said.
I will just say that I took my first course on Middle Eastern anthropology at Harvard. You know what we had to read the first book? The Quran.
Yes.
We all had to read the Quran. People would be shocked to read the Quran. They're so ignorant, totally ignorant, right? And find your fundamentalists and say, here's a book, read it. And it's prejudice, right? There's a lot of prejudice.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with it. You think I wasn't discriminated against here at Berkeley?
Yeah.
Are you kidding? I mean, I wasn't just the first woman. I went up to a guy at a party. This is the second year I was here. Fortunately, I was raised by parents who didn't encourage us to get excited by ignorant people. If they say something, they just say, no, they're ignorant. But it was at a party, and I went up to him and I said, you people in political science should give tenure to this woman who'd written more than the men had written, but she never got tenure. She was an adjunct. And he looked at me and he said, just be glad the anthropology department hired you. And jokingly, I said, you bet, when they got me, they got a woman and an Arab too. I was kidding. And you know what he said? Why do you call yourself that? I said, same reason JFK calls himself Irish. What do you want me to call myself? He said, how about Eastern Mediterranean? Ignorant. You think I'm going to get upset?
And also, I want to add to what you're saying, because I teach history. I teach American history. And one of the things is appalling. You see a lot of the right the women getting in this country. It's only about 100 years. It's not a long time. And a lot of people here have no idea about the status of women in the 1950s.
Look, the main thing to teach is there's no country in the world where women are not discriminated against, period.
Exactly, yeah.
So nobody can be smart-ass.
Thank you. I have I guess my question is pretty broad. What role do you see Muslims playing in Islamophobia? I mean, when you think of oppression or systems of oppression, they haven't merely depended on the person who's doing the oppression. They've oftentimes depended on the oppressed to sort of perpetuate these systems. I mean, you take, for example, during slavery, you had blacks who were in the home, who were considered house blacks, and you had blacks in the fields. You know, we make this discussion on sort of East versus West. So I guess I know this. I have in my head. I'm thinking, you know, in my own observations, like what role do you see Muslims actually playing in the perpetuation of biases against other Muslims? Is this due to some sort of like colonialism?
Sometimes you do it in different ways. Okay. There was a very interesting New York Times article when they had the games in Brazil, and there was one, I think, German sports person and one Egyptian. One was in a hijab and the other one was. It's an amazing story because the guy who wrote it ended by saying, so who is to say which one is more oppressed, the one in the hijab or the one in the bikini? And the one in the bikini thought she was great because she was liberated because she could be naked. That's her weird, I don't agree with that. The other one was semi-hijab, right? And they were both playing sports. That was a very good article and very thoughtful from the New York Times. So I put it up on my bulletin board, the picture of the two women and the question at the bottom, you know, who is really more liberated, this one or that one? And leave it to the people who are reading and looking at it to think about it. You got to get people thinking.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You can't legislate anti-Islamophobia.
Okay.
Or anti-anything, anti-black or anti. You can't legislate it.
All right. All right. Thank you.
We are all human. I'm always impressed whenever you get an Arab on the radio or TV or something. At the end, they always say, but we are all human. That's a very common statement. Now, how many Irish or how many whatever you're going to get saying we are all human?
Thank you.
One more question? Do we have anything from online? Okay. Going once? Going twice? No, you already had you got it privately. Thanks. So please help me thank Professor Nader for the lecture. We have the book available, and I think Professor Nader will sign your copy, so pick your copy and get it signed. And thank you for really attending and enlightening us for this lecture. Asalaamu alaikum.